Hello and welcome to AmericanNavalHistory.com. My name is John Sorensen and I am making a series of lessons to teach the history of the United States Navy. Our Navy has played a very important role in the history of our country. Without it, our nation and our whole world would be very different than it is today. This week I want to talk about a little lesser known naval action, but it's not totally unknown. I mean, you can look it up and find plenty of information about it, but it does not make it into most of the commonly published history books. In this story, the fleet commander totally disregards his orders, sails his fleet down to the Bahamas, conducts a totally successful and a very profitable raid on a lightly guarded British weapons cache, and brings back a supply of cannons and gunpowder that was desperately needed by the Continental Army. And along with that, he brings 3 extra ships back. And it is also the United States Marine Corps looked to this battle as being their first amphibious landing in their long and proud history. When the Continental Navy was first formed on October 13, 1775, Ezekiel, or Esek Hopkins, was chosen to be the first commander-in-chief. Hopkins had commanded a fleet of 10 warships during the French and Indian War. Now, excluding the ships in George Washington's Navy, the Alfred was the first ship commissioned into the Continental Navy. When you look at the list of ships on the slide, the number following the ship's name is the number of cannons that it carried. If there's a number of parentheses, what that means is I found a different book that had a different number in it. So either one could be right. But you can see that none of the ships were very large at all. Certainly none of them matched up to the British man-of-wars that carried 55 or 60 cannons on them. And also I'll go ahead and say that John Paul Jones was a lieutenant on the Alfred at this point in the war. The British Royal Governor of Virginia was the last royal governor left in the American colonies. His name was John Murray, but he was the Earl of Dunmore, so they called him Lord Dunmore. Dunmore was very pro-British and very unpopular among the civilian population in Virginia. Even before the war started, everybody hated him. He shut down the Virginia legislature 3 times to prevent revolutionary speech and other activities. Dunmore was disliked by the people of Virginia so much that he and his family had to actually live out on the British Navy warship at anchor in Chesapeake Bay. He had to actually govern the state of Virginia, or the colony of Virginia, from the deck of a ship out in the bay, because the people that he governed hated him so much. And during the siege of Boston, when the war actually started, Dunmore was one of George Washington's many concerns. This one was not much talked about very often, and it never really developed into a problem, but it was a real concern of George Washington at the time. Lord Dunmore was plotting to attack some southern plantations along the rivers adjacent to the Chesapeake Bay. He would promise freedom to all the slaves on the plantations that he attacked if they would join his army and side with the British during the Revolutionary War. And John Adams was so worried about Dunmore that John Adams wrote in a letter that if Dunmore took 1,000 troops down to Georgia and South Carolina, he could easily come back with over 20,000 in his army. The raids did not actually get started until the fall of 1775. Now, the fleet was actually ready to sail in January 1776, the new American Navy fleet under the command of Esek Hopkins. Now, his mission was to sail down out of Philadelphia, down the Delaware River, out to the Atlantic Ocean, and then go south and then up to Chesapeake Bay and search for Lord Dunmore. Now, there was one clause in his orders that said that if the weather interfered with his mission, that he was to, and this is a quote, Follow such courses as your best judgment shall suggest to you as most useful to the American cause and the distress to the enemy by all means in your power. Okay? So if the weather interfered with the mission he was given, he was allowed to pretty much freelance his fleet to do the best that he thought he could do to support the American cause and defeat the enemy. So Hopkins, they departed Philadelphia on January 4th, 1776 on the mission. And he did not actually reach the open ocean until February 17th, about 6 weeks later, because there were a lot of ice issues on the river was frozen over, and they just had to sit up and wait for a couple of weeks. And other ships were gathering in there too, and but make a long story short, it was just February 17th by the time they got out to the sea. And it's very interesting to note that several weeks after he departed Philadelphia, 2 days before leaving the Delaware River, on February 14th, Commodore Hopkins issued orders to the other ships in his fleet that said that if any of the ships got separated by storm or for any other reasons, that they were going to meet at a rendezvous point at the south end of Abaco Island. Here, let's look at Hopkins' last order to his captains that were issued well after he was clear away from his congressional commanders and before he got to sea. Look at this map. The short little curling red line that goes from the mouth of the Delaware River out into the ocean and curls back into the Chesapeake Bay is the route of the fleet's legitimate mission. Now that little curl there, that is the mission that he was given by Congress and ordered to follow. Okay? Okay? That is where he was told to go. But just in case there was a storm that separates the ships and the fleet, they were told to rendezvous way down at Abaco Island in the Bahamas. Okay, the fleet commander does need to pick a rendezvous point, but Abaco Island is 900 miles away from the intended track. Here is a close-up map of the Bahama Islands, which were British colonies at that time. You can see that Abaco Island up in the northern end of the island chain. Now look due south of Abaco Island, you can see Nassau. Now Nassau is a town on New Providence Island, and New Providence Island is the name of the actual island. Okay, and this is the same Nassau that all the vacation cruise ships go to today. It's a very popular tourist spot. In 1775, it had a small fort on it, but it was very little military significance. It was used mostly to hold naval stores and for the ships to load up with before making their long journey from the West Indies back to the Great Britain. But when the war started up in the American colonies, or when the war was about to start, Lord Dunmore was afraid that his large weapons supplies and gunpowder would be taken by the colonists. His troops in Virginia were greatly outnumbered by the rebels and the Sons of Liberty and the anti-British citizens, that he was afraid that they could overrun his defenses and take all of his gunpowder and all of his cannons and all of his military supplies and materiel. So what Dunmore did was he had all of the colony of Virginia's military stores put on ships and hauled down to the island of Nassau in the Bahamas, or the island of New Providence, to the Fort Nassau, to be for safekeeping, because nobody would look for them there. So there was a very large cache of British military supplies being lightly guarded in Nassau on New Providence Island, and the American fleet was heading down there to take it. Okay, the fleet was assembled off of Abaco Island. on March 1st, 1776, and there were 2 British sloops that were already in that area, and the Americans captured them, and they actually used these sloops to help ferry the Marines to shore when they finally had their amphibious landing. At about 12 noon on March 3rd, the Marines began hitting the beach about a mile south of Fort Montague. The beach landing was unopposed by the British. Once everybody was ashore and they were getting the men organized for the mile-long march, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a messenger appeared from the royal governor of the Bahamas. The messenger asked them what their intentions were for landing on their island. Now, you see, the governor, he was more afraid that this was a Spanish force, and he was worried more about the Spanish Navy and the Spanish Army than he was about, North American colonists. But, he was almost relieved to find out that they were Americans. Samuel Nichols was the captain in charge of the Marines on the beach, and let's say there were about a little bit less than 300 Marines and a few sailors on shore under Nichols' command. Now, Nichols, he was in charge of the shore party. Everybody that was on the beach and everything that would happen on the land part of this mission was under Nichols' command. And he told the messenger that they were after the king's military supplies and the gunpowder and the cannons and whatever military supplies that they could get. He told the messenger that if they were given what they came for, and if they were left unopposed, that nobody would get hurt and no property would be damaged. And see, this is a painting of the invasion. You can see Fort Montague in the background behind the 2 sloops. And judging from this picture, this landing site is the location of a large hotel today. You can see in this picture the Wasp and the Providence schooners that were used to carry the Marines closer to the shore, while the rest of the fleet remained way out in the background. You can see them way back there, the rest of the fleet. But you can tell that they are the schooners because they are bigger than the 2 sloops, and they have 2 masts on them, and the smaller sloops on the left, they only have 1. And it was a short march, about 1 mile, maybe a little bit less, from the beachhead to Fort Montague. During the march, 2 cannon shots were fired from the fort in their general direction, but nobody was hit, nobody was hurt. This next slide, number 9 if you're counting. Now this is a painting of the Marines taking Fort Montague. Notice one thing that you do not see in this picture. Think about it. You do not see any British soldiers resisting the attack. The fort was almost totally abandoned by the time the Marines approached. There should have been about 40 men there, but the governor had been there that morning and during the beach invasion, and he ordered most of the men to fall back down up to Fort Nassau, which was another mile further down the road. On this next slide, first look at the picture on the bottom. This is Fort Montague. Look at how small it is. You see that guy on the right? Now imagine that he's 6 feet tall, or almost 6 feet tall, and you can tell that the walls of this fort can't be any more than 10 feet high, if that much. This is a very small fort and not intended to be defended from land attack by 300 Marines. See, the Marines captured and had total control of this fort by 4 p.m. in the afternoon on March 3rd. Fort Montague had some cannons on it and some gunpowder, but the bulk of the war supplies and the weapons, they were up at Fort Nassau, and everybody knew that. Now this is where Samuel Nichols made a decision to remain in Fort Montague overnight. Now it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had just taken a fort, and they decided, well, let's stay here overnight and press on to Fort Nassau in the morning, because they expected a little bit of resistance at Fort Nassau, because you know, the word was out that there were about 200 militiamen on the island, British militiamen, that might defend Fort Nassau. So to march another mile and to attack a fort that's defended by 200 militiamen, you know, that might bring you into the night. So they decided to camp out at Fort Montague overnight. That's the night of March 3rd. Now, two things happened that night of March 3rd, 1776. First, the Americans spread out leaflets all over town telling the local populations that they were only after the king's guns and gunpowder, and nobody would be hurt and no property would be damaged if they were allowed to proceed with their mission without interference. And the second thing that happened that night was that the royal governor of the Bahamas, he got together with some of his friends, and what they did was they loaded 150 casks of gunpowder out of Fort Nassau into a ship, the Mississippi Packet. They loaded that ship, and it set sail for St. Augustine that night. So the very next morning, early the next morning, on March 4th, the Marines they left Fort Montague and started marching towards Fort Nassau. And on their way to Fort Nassau, they stopped at the governor's house and demanded the keys to the fort. And the governor, you know, what choice did he have? He gave them the keys to the fort, and basically he surrendered right then and there. Even before they got to the fort had been surrendered to the American Marines. Now, this slide shows a total of everything that was captured by the Americans from the two forts, but it says 80, you know, you add it up, it says 88 cannons and 24 casks of gunpowder, but I have another book by Willis J. Abbott says that the Americans captured over 100 cannons, but hey, whichever one you want to believe, both of them will agree that it was a very profitable raid and it was very successful. You know, either 88 or over 100. That's a lot of cannons to take from the enemy. Well, it took 2 weeks for the Americans to load all of this new equipment and gunpowder onto their ships. So they had to actually occupy the city of Nassau for 2 weeks, and they kept the royal governor under house arrest in his own house, you know, nice and comfortable, but they didn't let him get out to organize any kind of a counterattack or anything against him. But they actually had to take another British ship. So that made 3 British ships that they, you know, you can add to that total of everything they captured, because they just did not have enough cargo space, and the 7 ships that they brought did not have enough cargo space. So they needed the 3 British ships that they captured to help haul everything back. And the amazing thing is they captured all of these supplies and these ships without firing a single shot, and they suffered 0 casualties. The royal governor, he did complain that the American officers drank all of his alcohol during their visits, but the American fleet sailed from New Providence bound for Rhode Island on March 17th, and that happened to be the same day that George Washington watched the British evacuate Boston, Evacuation Day. They did meet up with a couple of British ships when they got to Narragansett Bay, but we'll have to leave that for another lesson. All of the captured supplies and cannons and gunpowder were all delivered safely and successfully to the Continental Army. Now, whatever happened to that Lord Dunmore character, that the original target of the fleet's mission? I mean, the guy that they were actually assigned to go stop, you know, whatever happened to him? Although he did conduct a few raids in the fall of 1775, he did not actually get his plan fully implemented or started until the summer of 1776. He actually got a pretty good start to his plan. He had a few small successes. He sailed up the Potomac River. He hit a few plantations. He gathered some of the slaves to join his force, and after each raid, he collected more and more slaves to join him, and his force grew larger and stronger each time. Then finally, he was stopped by the. But he ended up getting stopped, and he turned around, and he was chased out of the Chesapeake Bay, and they chased him out to the open ocean, where they couldn't follow him anymore. And so what Dunmore did was he sailed down to the West Indies, and when he got to the West Indies, all these slaves that had joined up with his force, he sold them. He sold them right back into slavery. Now, bringing back a large cache of weapons and gunpowder when gunpowder was desperately needed by the Continental Army on its first voyage proved the great value of the Continental Navy, and it proved the great value that the Navy could be and what it would be during the duration of this war and beyond this war into the future wars of our nation. My name is John Sorensen, and thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com.